before we get started, it's important to know that we always recommend that your bicycle be professionally assembled. Or if you choose to follow this video and do home assembly, we recommend that a professional bicycle mechanic safety check your bicycle before riding. Now let's get started.
Hey guys, it's Eddie from Priority. Let's assemble your new Start 16. So grab some household scissors and a Phillips screwdriver. Let's get into it. Let's start by opening the parts box and seeing what's inside. So we've got your Priority Owner's Manual, and this is the time when you want to read through, familiarize yourself with it, and review it with your little one. Also in the box, we've got our rear reflector and hardware, a right and a left pedal, a 4 and a 5 millimeter Allen wrench, and a 15 millimeter open wrench. Now let's cut all the packaging material off of the bike. All right, now that all the cardboard, plastic, foam, and tape has been removed from the bike, start by turning the fork around so that the brake is on the front and the stem is facing forward. Now grab your 4 millimeter Allen key and remove the 4 faceplate bolts. Set the faceplate aside for now and grab your handlebars. So at this point, you want to make sure that the cables are running correctly. See how I'm bringing this rear brake cable over the top of the stem so that all of our cables are sitting out in front of the bike and nothing's wrapped. We don't want the cable wrapped around the top or wrapped underneath the bottom of the fork. So now, holding the handlebars in place up against the stem so that they're sitting upright, just going to take the faceplate, hold it up onto the handlebars, and then just start threading in those 4 faceplate bolts again. I'm just going to start by hand, just so I can feel those threads catch a little bit. And now I'm going to use my 4 millimeter Allen key to thread those in. When installing the handlebar onto the stem, it's important to keep an eye on the knurling, and you want to make sure that these knurled lines are equally spaced behind the faceplate of the stem. Similarly, you want there to be an equal gap between the faceplate and the stem on top as on the bottom before you snug up the bolts. Now, let's install the front wheel. So, grab your wheel and loosen the axle nuts. You don't have to take them completely off, but you want to loosen them so that there's plenty of space on the axle for the dropouts to fit. So now, setting that wheel aside for a second, let's just open up the brake. So I'm going to use one hand to hold the noodle. This is called the noodle right here. And the other hand to pull this side of the caliper inwards. So I'm removing the noodle from the caliper itself and allowing this to spring open. So now lifting up the front of the bike, just roll that wheel backwards and place the dropouts onto the axle of the fork. You might need to unbolt the axle nuts a little bit more if you haven't already unbolted them enough. But we want all 3 of these washers to sit on the outside of the dropout, so there shouldn't be any washers on the inside. And so the order here is wheel, dropout, and we've got a flat washer followed by a hooked washer, and we're going to install this hook washer so that the hook goes into the slot in the dropout of the fork. And then another flat washer and the axle nut. Similarly on this side, wheel, dropout, flat washer, hooked washer, installed, flat washer, axle nut. I'd like to snug those up by hand, and then with a little bit of weight on the handlebars, just to make sure the wheel's seated all the way in there, go ahead, start snugging these up. Do one a little bit tight, the next one a little bit more tight, and now firmly tighten them down so that the tool leaves an imprint in the palm of your hand. And now it's time to reconnect the front brake. So now, using one hand to push this side of the caliper in and pull the noodle back, use your other hand to guide the noodle into place. And then slide the dust cap over. Flip the kickstand down, and now the bike will hold itself up. Now to install the seat. When you're installing the seat post, you want to make sure you have at least this much inserted. There's a minimum insertion line here, so you don't want to exceed that. Flip open the quick release, insert the seat post, and then close the quick release. If you can still wiggle the seat side to side, then you'll want to open the quick release back up, and while holding the lever side, turn the nut side by hand. A couple of half turns should do it, so that it takes some effort to close the quick release. Now it's time to install the pedals. So if you look at your pedals, they should each be labeled with an R and an L. If they're not, if you look here, you can see that the left pedal has some knurling or some lines here on it. The right pedal does not. But let's start with the right pedal. So starting with your hand, insert the spindle of the pedal into the crank arm and turn it clockwise. You shouldn't feel a lot of resistance now. This should thread in pretty easily. If you're feeling resistance, it might not be threaded in correctly. So now, with the 15mm wrench, hold the rear wheel for resistance and turn the tool clockwise, nice and firm, so that the tool leaves an imprint in the palm of your hand. Now for the left pedal. I always like to do this with the crank arm facing forwards, so we have plenty of room to work with. Now the left pedal can be a little bit confusing because it is reverse threaded. That means that it's not righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, but lefty-tighty, righty-loosey. And that means that we turn it counterclockwise to thread it in. Now once again, I like to start this by hand. There shouldn't be a lot of resistance. Now, with a 15mm wrench, go ahead and snug that up nice and tight, holding the rear wheel with your other hand so that the tool leaves an imprint in the palm of your hand. All right, on to the reflectors. With your Phillips screwdriver at the ready, grab all the components of the rear reflector. So we've got a shim, a clamp, the reflector itself, and a bolt. So we're going to grab the clamp first and put this shim inside, and that's going to take up any extra space. So now there's a nut side on here, and there's a side that doesn't have a nut. The side with the nut goes on the inside. So just clip that around the frame right there. So now take the reflector. You can see that there's a side that sticks out a little bit. Take the bolt and just run that through so that the head of the bolt sits on the more flat side. Rotate this forward so that the side that protrudes lines up with the clamp. Angle it a little bit up. Take your Phillips screwdriver and then just make sure that that bolt screws in to the nutted side of the clamp. Nice and snug, and that one's all done. Now before tightening down the front reflector, I just want to make sure that the handlebars are at the right angle. So that's generally almost straight up, but a little bit closer to the angle of the fork. And that's a nice comfortable angle for most kids. And now that we have the right angle, let's go back in and just make sure the faceplate bolts are nice and snug, because we don't want those coming loose at all when our little one's riding. Now bring that reflector so that it's facing forwards and tighten it down with a Phillips screwdriver. At this point, go through and double check to make sure any of the bolts you touched and any of the ones you didn't are nice and snug. And roll this one on down to your local bike shop for a safety check. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Our contact information is on your screen.